Planet Radio is a part of the Amateur Radio Network. Thank you for tuning in to Planet Radio, therapy for the heart, mind, and soul. Thank you for listening to Planet Radio, therapy for the heart, mind, and soul. We're going to discuss suicide. It's a pretty direct topic, but there's a lot other things to it than that. Some people who have successfully committed suicide, survivors, some people on both sides of this issue. So there might be some things you might not want to hear in this. So at the very end, we're going to discuss solutions in the last 5 minutes. But if you do feel comfortable, please join us in this discussion. Planet Radio is a part of the Amateur Radio Network. Thank you for listening to Planet Radio. We're going to have a really important Saturday discussion, and it's a very significant day for a couple of reasons. April 1st being the anniversary of a passing of a very close family friend who committed suicide, and because we're discussing something I think is very serious, we're confronting it from many different angles. So please know that from someone who survived a family or friend that committed suicide, it is a very different type of death. So we're going to hit on some topics, and I think there are some warning signs, maybe or maybe not, that I can maybe offer some insight. But let me just assume for a moment that you have a family member that's been in crisis for a long time. Okay, I know this firsthand. I've been one of those type of people that have been on both sides of this. So, and therapy is one of the tools that we've used, but we also look at other conditions or surroundings that might be causing the problems. And a lot of them are most likely situational, things that are out of your control. And that's really hard for somebody who maybe just suffered a really major setback health-wise. Because once somebody suffers this huge setback, it's really hard to get back on track, but it's not impossible. But there are other factors. It could be alcoholism, addiction. Those are other things, and there are warning signs. Not everybody that drinks and uses drugs is going to end up there, but they have the potential to do that. And there's a lot of things we're going to discuss here. So we go into the break, we're going to discuss why peer support counseling is so huge, because there's such an increase in MST, military sexual trauma, to suicidal tendencies, which a lot of people might take that recklessly. I do not. I take this really serious. And there are a couple factors, and there's also people that trigger people. And one of the worst things, somebody who has these concerns or is addressing suicidal behavior, you have to know the triggers. And if you've suffered from maybe you didn't successfully commit suicide, but you're one of those people planning it out. Most people who are suicidal plan out their suicide. They sometimes even fantasize about it, and it is that way. To me, there's good and evil in all of us, and when somebody who's as sensitive to suicide, they're usually predisposition for it. And the sad truth is, if somebody does commit suicide and they are a parent, their children are most likely going to repeat that cycle. And one of the cycles, it's a vicious cycle, okay? And it's not an easy one. In fact, it's a very difficult one to survive if you can at least overcome and endure it. But we're going to come back from break, and we're going to talk about some of the signs, signals, symptoms, and warnings and triggers. And then we're going to come up with
You're listening to
afterwards.
Radio Theater at the Moonlight Lounge on Planet Radio.
Okay, so we're back. I have to take a little bit of a break. Just get in the habit of hearing those breaks. Now, I do require a sense of humor here, because as far as I'm concerned, as serious as an issue as it is, there's a way to be direct and confronting bad behaviors in others that trigger us or trigger people that might be in that situation. And if you're in a hostile environment, and it's going to be a lot easier for somebody to act out one of the things I think is a factor is if you have a family history of abuse. And abuse could be a wide range of things, okay? Some people just think it's physical abuse, but it's intimidation, it's passive aggressive, it's rolling eyes, it's subtle borderline abusive behavior, or it could be just plain out abusive behavior. And a lot of us who probably exhibit signs don't necessarily have to go down that road, but if you see signs of you being an abusive person, or you've kind of picked up bad habits, it's pretty common for somebody who's lived around an abusive person. Like in my case, I had to go back to therapy many times, and I'm going back into counseling again because we had somebody in our home that was very abusive, and I'm learning better to cope with it. And it's very hard because it's outside of my control. I can't fix the situation, and I hit a rock bottom. I was at the bottom, so I can personally talk about this. But when I confronted suicidal behavior on both sides of this, I would say that most people probably wouldn't have looked at somebody like me who's been abused. But, taking some biblical scriptures away from this, I can say that it's very hard to live around somebody that's abusive. Subtly passive aggressive behavior is one of them. And if I don't give people an opportunity to open up, they might not be able to find answers. We have like some therapeutic tools. Ones I'm working on with somebody very close to me right now is sound frequency therapy. Sound frequency therapy is very, very helpful for somebody that suffer PTSD, or in some cases they've confronted other abuse in their life. So you're unraveling. You might not be able to do anything about the helplessness that comes from abuse, alcohol addiction. You might not be really able to put yourself in a situation, but at least if you can see the signs and journal about it, you're going to open yourself up for all types of things. It came to a tipping point for me today. Um, and you don't want to lash out, but that's what ends up happening. And it's because you get to a point in your life where people can abuse and use you if you allow them. That's part of it. But if you don't recognize or you don't acknowledge that, yeah, you're being abused or used, you're going to have a tendency to live with it, and eventually it's just going to blow up. And that's common in an abusive home. And when you live around abusive people for years, there's some people who are just blatantly abusive, and some people they'll look for ways to attack you. And this is not how a functional home runs. You can't run a functional home with abusive people. You can't control other people's behavior either at the same time. But if you want to be able to resolve it quickly without police getting involved and then erupting into a violent experience, it's quick to say to remove yourself from that person and your relationship just long enough that you can get the help you need. I had to do this. I had to walk away. And I left, and I kept leaving. I had to make a decision at some point. Am I going to fall into the trap and let them set me off, or them be set off? And knowing that they already exhibited the signs of extremely abusive behavior, like blatant abusive behavior, acting out, physically abusive, addiction. You meet all the qualifications and they're not willing to do something, or if they're willing to do it, they are aware of it and then they know what to do. In this case, in my home, if you're aware that you're having a problem, instead of us saying it's your problem, you did this, you did that, everyone gets around in the table and we have a powwow, and how are we going to deal with this individually? And therefore you become supportive instead of just directing it all on one person. It's easy to point out one person, but everyone plays a role. And that's one of the things I learned about the birth order. And Carol Hamilton, who was a close friend of me when I was a young kid, gave me this book, and she's very supportive. She's actually a writer for the Examiner, and she's got a Christian blog, and you want to look up Carol Hamilton. She was one of the first people, other than like Erica Harkema, but she gave me this book on the birth order, and I never forgot that book because it really explains the birth order and family roles that people play. And one of the things about role playing is it's therapeutic. Like a lot of people who are overcoming addictions or having problems, like I know people say there's not an answer for everything, and there's not a pill for everything either, but there are things you can do to encourage one another at home. And home-based therapy has been a primary um, I put this in primarily. We apply this at home. I have at least, and we all have different issues at home, so it's easier for each of us to come in neutral, and you don't present these concerns when in the middle of a crisis. Of course not. So we have to have scheduled time aside. That's been a pattern in my relationship with my significant other, is that we work together, we partner together, we pick time, we watch each other's patterns and lifestyle choices, and what we do is we make a choice together when is the right time for us to meet up, and then we give each other our space. And one of the things I noticed with my significant other is that we have this agreement. We both agree that this is where we're at in different areas, so we try to work it out. And that's the difference between people who are in a working relationship and they're working towards a goal and want to, versus people who are outside of that circle. And if they don't want to be included, you're not upset, you're not angry, but if you've already had a past history with them, it's really hard to bring them into your safe place. You know what I mean? And as much people argue about safe places, it is really significant with abuse survivors. And unfortunately, we live in a world that's taking sides, and this is not about taking sides anymore. Nowadays, every person's been affected, or, and in fact, unfortunately, they say trigger. It's true. I used to pretend like this isn't true, but they've even called me a snowflake. I'm like, if that's what it comes down to, then I guess that's what we're going to accept, you know? But my religious and political views, to me, are personal to me. They're not other people's reasons to attack me or criticize me. And if you've already come from an abusive home, criticizing each other is one of the hardest things to live with. Because the one thing is, if you've lived on your own long enough, you're not going to want to continue that pattern. So a vicious cycle is a vicious cycle, and the only way to recover from it, and it's a dark place, it really becomes a miserable experience. Now, there's some people, they can be a functionally dysfunctional home. They can function in a dysfunction for long enough, and they make a decision, I'm going to be able to have to survive this until I come up with a better reason. And it's not as if you can't endure for a while, but you know you're not going to be able to outlast abuse. And then one of the things I learned is knowing patterns in an abusive home. You know you're only going to have so much energy for that person. And there's some people, they will deprive you of energy. And we've been on both sides of this. So it's not as if we don't talk about this to the extent that all of us have participated in some kind of dysfunction, whether we're victims of it or part of the problem. And one of the identifiers for me is that if you're playing a role in it, instead of feeling ashamed and guilty for functioning in a dysfunctional home, and recognize that as much as you're playing a role in the dysfunction, you don't have to continue. And at some point, what people decide to do in this process is they recognize, I do not have to participate. I have to end these relationships because it's no longer safe for me to communicate with them because they are not willing to work with me. And one of the hardest things about this is, as caring, as loving as you can be, you know it's danger for some people to stick around. There are tendencies for people to act out and get angry and mean, and they don't want to cooperate. It's not a matter of asking. It's not a matter of participating. They are put off by that. And what ends up happening is you can no longer operate without it being to the point where it's getting too extreme. And one of the extremes about abuse is that if you've been through this, you know you've been on one extreme or the other. So if you're not centered, you're not going to function right. You're not going to feel good. it doesn't matter how much you want to. If you know they have a tendency to set you off, you're going to have to recognize what you need to do. So we're going to leave it there, because I don't like to rehash problems. It's really a touchy topic as it is. So we're going to spend the majority of the time as we just address a lot of the dysfunction. You address it, and then you write it out and you sort it out. This could trigger people just itself. So I don't like to really focus on the minutia and all the harsh things that people do. I try to approach it the best way I can without overstepping. But I just shared what goes on in some of my situations. And one of the things I learned in this, sadly, and as hard as this has been for me, is that if I don't end these relationships the right way, it's going to erupt, and it's always bad. It's never a good situation, not for me, not for the other person. And if they create the situation, I got to create ways to walk away from it. And what I've learned in this process is that you're going to have to find ways to walk away from them. They are not going to they're going to keep doing that behavior, but you do not have to participate in it. And one of the things I've come to the conclusion is, well, you don't want to get to the point where it's going to erupt. And one of the things is that when you fall into the trap of being around somebody who treats you with this type of behavior, you're going to I know I have. I'll react to it. So I know I have to find ways to not respond to them. There's a Bible scripture that says that you don't serve man you can't serve two masters. You can't serve man or the world, and the world both, and be happy. You can't. One of the hardest things is I was really set off and triggered, that I realized that I no longer can do this. I can no longer go on in this relationship. I can no longer live with that kind of abusive, intolerant, passive-aggressive behavior, because they have exhibited this sign over and over again. And I recognize that if I don't walk away from that, I'm going to get hurt, and that's been the pattern. And the pattern is that usually we end up in a homeless shelter and destitute and losing time at work. And when you're at work and people behave this way, it can happen at any place, anywhere anymore. And if they go out of the way to be abusive and there's no reason for it, then you can't own that. All you can do is own your own reaction, response to it. But I really, really warn against confrontations for a lot of reasons. So I'm going to pick up there here in a moment. And the reason I am going to address it is that because there are therapeutic tools that we encourage you to use. By doing so, well, let me just go ahead and finish this up because we only have a little bit of tape. I want you to know there are tools that we're going to put in the description box below. Sound therapy frequency. I don't want to take up too much time, but I really want to get to this because I think I overused that time that we need to talk about this, is those sound therapy techniques and other exercise techniques. People who've come from an abusive home always have a tendency for it to be focused on their physical looks and a physical body. So there are exercise therapy that we're going to use to rein it back in. People who've been conditioned to believing that they're one thing when they're not. This is why exercise therapy is a part of it. It applies to dance therapy, applies to people who have been sexually abused. A lot of people go the opposite direction. They like exercise, and then because of physical or sexual abuse or something that happened around them, they have to get to the point where they can at least appreciate exercise therapy, believe it or not, because some people have reverted the opposite direction. They'll let themselves become overweight as a result of years of abuse, and they are totally turned off by exercise, believe it or not. So actually, fitness becomes a part of the therapy, and we're learning more about this, believe me, because there are people who have lived in a world where it's vain and you're only identified by your physical qualities, and unfortunately that's just the world we live in. But part of cross-training is that we have to go as far as emphasizing therapy, exercise therapy, like literally. I'm not kidding either. One of the affects of abuse or triggers or abusive behavior is that if you liked fitness and you were sexually assaulted, one of the things that goes first is fitness and exercise, and it's part of the therapy. So I would consult your therapist and ask them what to do about exercise, physical therapy. Some people who've been sexually abused or have physical trauma, they need to be back in the fitness. So PT sometimes applies to this. I call it cross training because we can identify it with that, but some people identify exercise therapy as dance movement, art therapy, but ways to get back to adapting to a new way of life. And it starts today. Listen, day one is day one. Every day is an opportunity to seize and take back control, because one of the worst parts of abuse and suicide is that you succumb to the helplessness. And my dad once worded it as learned helplessness. And because addiction counseling is so serious, because if you really unravel it, alcoholism and addiction's usually associated with this trap that people find. And now, today was a particularly important day, and I started it by telling you about the numbers and the statistics of suicide and confronting it. We can address a lot of the things and the factors and the things like that you can look up on your own. But one of the ugly taboos about suicide is that it only happens to certain people. No, I think everyone nowadays is most likely going to know somebody, or they're going to confront some kind of person around them that may be suicidal. They're not going to tell you. So it's awareness for everyone. We're not looking at it single-handedly like it's just one person. Everyone will at some point know somebody, without knowingly or unknowingly know that somebody has either attempted suicide. And the depths of despair is one of the worst, hardest things to overcome. And it says in the Bible to not be overcome by despair, because once this stuff overcomes you, you may not come out of it. So that's why I really encourage people to pray, apply some of the things we use. Not all of this might be for you, but take what you want and leave the rest. Thank you.